Hello, everybody, and it's good to be back with you again as we start our online Bible study program again. And for the next, I think it's going to take me about 7 or 8 weeks, probably somewhere a couple weeks before Christmas. We'll be done with this, but we're going to study the letter of Philippians. It's one of my favorite in the New Testament. It probably does not receive nearly enough recognition, even though it has some just outstanding theological messages in it itself. So it's probably going to take 6 or 7 weeks, depending on how things kind of unfold as we go through. But the letter itself is only 4 chapters, so it's not very long. But wow, does it have some great messaging in it. So I hope that you'll enjoy this just as much as I do. And we'll get into this today. I'm just going to give you some background information that will help you to have a better understanding of how, what the messaging of Philippians is, but also how would you approach it yourself. And maybe some of the ways that I approach Philippians will be very helpful for you as you approach Philippians, but also other areas of writing in the Bible itself. So, about Philippians, real quick, let me give you some little bit of historical background information about it, and then talk about the letter itself, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. So, the letter of Philippians was addressed to residents in Philippi. Philippi is a settlement in Macedonia. So Macedonia is northeast, basically straight north and east of Greece itself. Macedonia is not fully Greek. They are related to the Greek culture. In fact, there's a mixing of people here in the Macedonian region. That's probably why the Greeks didn't think very fondly of them, because they were encountering other cultures and they began to be somewhat of a mixed Greek culture. But anyway, so it is in Macedonia. They're not fully Greek. The city itself, or the settlement, was named after Alexander the Great's father, King Philip. So it has a storied past for sure. And so it's a very, very interesting area. Now, Rome itself, the Roman Empire, conquered Greece and Macedonia about 160 years before the birth of Jesus. Or 150 years probably, more likely. I think it was 145, 146, somewhere around there, BCE. So about 150 years before the birth of Jesus, Rome completely conquered Greece and Macedonia, and they became part of the Roman Empire itself. Now, Philippi, in regards to the Roman Empire, Philippi was a extreme outpost. And what I mean by that is it sat right on the border, the boundary of the Roman Empire. It sat right on the boundary of the northeastern Roman Empire. So it was right there at the very edge of the Roman Empire. Now, you may have heard about Roman peace, or it's called Pax Romana. It never, ever materialized to the extent they claimed that it did, that being the Roman historians. There was peace within the Roman Empire itself, meaning there weren't as many civil wars as what there used to be during this time frame of first century, the first century of Christianity, first century CE, and even before Jesus' birth. But it was relatively calm, except on the borders. This is what I'm getting to, is that at the borders and places like Philippi, there was always unrest, because they were right there at the very edge. The enemy was just over the line. So it was a very tense area to some degree. It was mostly sparsely populated before Rome began to use it in a special way. So there wasn't a large population here until much later. Now, when the Roman Caesar by the name of Augustus, and he is the one that comes right after Julius Caesar, so we have Augustus Caesar. In fact, he's probably the most prominent of all the emperors, probably the most successful and the most powerful of all the emperors there were. He took Philippi as a project, in a sense. And so he began to move military retirees. In fact, this is so interesting about the Roman Empire, is that they actually gave their soldiers pensions. So they had truly a professional army. And so a person could serve under Augustus, it was 20 years. Later it was changed to 25 years. But if you served 25 years, you could earn a land grant and a pension for the rest of your life. So it was a pretty good deal to serve in the Roman military, even though it could be dangerous at times. So Philippi, here's what's so important. Philippi, or Augustus, made Philippi a place where military retirees could go, receive a land grant, and they would have their presence right there. So these are military retirees. It became a community of military retirees. That gave the Roman Empire, even though it was retirees, it gave them experienced, seasoned soldiers right at the boundary, the border, even though they weren't officially in the army anymore, the military. But it did give them that military presence where these people could be used if absolutely needed. So it was interesting what Augustus did. So this is important. So when Paul writes the letter to Philippians, this is mostly a Roman settlement, mostly Roman people. This is going to be critical when we start to understand what is going on in Philippians. Remember this. This is a Roman settlement. This is a Roman culture, even though it is in Macedonia. So, quick thing about the letter itself of Philippians. And I'm going to come back to this, the connection between the Roman government and the city of Philippi. The letter of Philippians itself is quite interesting in that it is one of the few letters by Paul where we know for sure that he was imprisoned. In fact, in chapter 1, we find out that he talks about being imprisoned, and he even talks about these guards, a Praetorian guards, which are a storied body of elite guards, let's put it that way, that kind of served as the emperor's bodyguards. They were the premier soldiers. And for some reason, these soldiers are guarding Paul. Paul seems to have developed friendships and relationships with them. It even seems that some of them have become Christian under Paul's teaching and influence. So, Paul writes this letter from his imprisonment, which is probably in Rome. So he writes this letter, and he's been to Philippi. He has a very warm relationship with these folks here. We find that out in chapter 4. Well, in chapter 1 and chapter 4, we find out that Paul has a very loving and warm relationship with these folks. And so he writes this letter, and he is thanking them and asking for some requests. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a second, but this is what I want you to know about the letter itself. Basically, we have a similar structure that we would have in all letters. But one thing to remember about this is that when we approach a letter by Paul, so we're thinking about New Testament, thinking about genres. When we have a letter, we have to start looking for the reason why Paul wrote such and such letter. Could be behavioral needs need to be addressed. It could be, like in Philippians, a financial request is given. It could be an introduction, like in Romans. But the point is that Paul often takes a long time to lay out his argument or his point. And so many times we probably fail to cover enough of the context in order to really understand what's going on. So I'm going to give you some heads up and some clues about how to come to Philippians itself. This Roman influence, let me come back to this again. The Roman influence upon the letter of Philippians it's paramount that we understand what is going on here. This is the key to understanding Philippians. So, Philippi is a Roman settlement by the time that Paul writes his letter. In fact, it is a Roman settlement that is comprised of Roman military retirees. So it's a military settlement. And the rule of law for citizenry throughout the Roman Empire rule of law was vital, foundational for them. It was very, very important within the Roman Empire for Roman citizenry, for them to behave according to Roman expectations or according to Roman rule of law. So this is going to be one of the comparisons that happens in Philippians when we're thinking about expectations within a secular society versus expectations within a Christian community. Rome had expectations for certain behavior, that their citizens would behave according to the rule of law. And so this is very, very important. So this is on their minds in Philippi, living according to a certain way. So now God's expectations, as we find out in this letter, is that God has expectations for people to live according to a way that corresponds with heavenly citizenship. So it's really important, as you read through the New Testament, to understand that Christians really aren't a part of anything except God's kingdom. Yeah, we're in the world. We have to live in this world until the Lord takes us home. We're just transitory travelers. Read 1 Peter. We are aliens and sojourners in this world. This is not our home. We're just a passing through. And our citizenship is in heaven. But even though we're passing through, we still have to behave like our citizenry or our citizen expectations that come from heaven itself. So I want to come back to the citizenry in just a moment, but again, let me go back to the letter of Paul and show you how this is so very, very important. As I said, the letter of Philippians is pretty unique. I remember a long time ago, I read a book by Charles Swindoll, who was trying to get a handle on the theme of Philippians, and he proposed that the theme was joy, and joy very well could be, well, it is a prominent idea within the letter of Philippians itself. It's just that I don't think that that's Paul's main purpose. Even though the word for joy shows up several times in Philippians, it is a very positive type of letter, except for one part, two parts actually, when he begins to explain the Judaizers in chapter 3, and then also there's a problem with two women, Euodia and Syntyche. They're quarreling or something like that, and they've got to get this straightened out. So there could be a possibility of a beginning point, a nexus of disunity, and Paul wants to prevent that before it gets too far ahead. But this letter is very, very unique in that he really doesn't address any problems except for this contention between Euodia and Syntyche, and then he doesn't make a big deal about it. There's only like one verse where he talks about it, and he talks about getting these two people to reconcile. So they must have had some kind of prominent positions in the church itself. In fact, we do know in the Greek culture that often elderly women did have a more significant role within family units than other places. So that's not a problem, except that they're not getting along. And so it's going to cause a disruption in the church, and they have got to get some things straightened out. Philippians itself has one of the most Christological explanations of Christ within the entire New Testament. So what I mean by Christological is something about the study of Christ or some kind of information that gives us about Christ or something to that effect. Philippians 2, 6 through 10 is a phenomenal piece of literature about the divine nature of Jesus. There is no other writing in the New Testament that is as clear as this. Now, the Gospel of John is very clear also, but Philippians itself gives us information about Jesus that no other New Testament writing gives us. So, for instance, that Jesus actually maybe had the ability to bring his godly powers with him, but he chose not to use them. So he had all of his godness within him. All of his divine nature was with him. All of God was in him. He could have done anything he wanted to do. All the power he had was embodied within that incarnational representation, Christ. yet he did not use it to his own advantage, is what Paul tells us. And so he had all that power. He could have stopped the crucifixion. He could have stopped people arresting him. He could have done so many things. But he chose the path of redemption that God had planned, and he achieved the salvation plan for God. So there's information there. When we get to Philippians 2, it's going to be really, really interesting when we look at that passage, because it is just brilliant and so beautiful what he has to say there. Now, the letter itself, it's a typical letter structure. You have your opening section. This will be where Paul gives some, I, Paul, writing to you, such and such persons or people in such and such place. So you have the opening greetings. Basically, he introduces himself and he tells who he's writing to. And so after that, we have a Thanksgiving section. And the Thanksgiving section is in chapter 1 of Philippians, is pretty prominent. I mean, it's really, really positive what he has to say about this church in Philippi. So we have that, and then we have the body, or the body of the letter. Now, in the body itself, whenever you have the body, usually comes after a Thanksgiving section or a blessing section, something like that. The body of the letter is where the main information's at, the main point or points. In Philippians, I think it's a point. In 1 Corinthians, we have several points that are in the body of the letter. In Romans, we have a couple points in the body of the letter. Here we also have a point in the body of the letter. And so it's important for us to identify what is going on within that body itself. Now, I want to come back to this. Now, there is a concluding section. It starts in chapter 4. And what's so interesting about this concluding section is that it's really long for a letter of this size. Paul has more to say, but it's in a concluding type of section. It's about their financial sharing that they have been doing with him, and he addresses that, and he addresses this contention problem, and he thanks them for what they've done for him. So it is rather lengthy what he does here, but still, we do have this concluding section. And within that, he gives some plans also about some of the things he would like to do in the future necessary. Now, it's not as pronounced here in Philippians, but generally, these concluding sections will have something to the effect of some request made or some information given about travel or something like that. So Paul fits the typical format here. Now, obviously, these letters are not going to be, classified. They're not going to be structured the same way every time. But we see these elements basically within the letter itself. And it seems to be structured somewhat according to this manner. Now, the body of the letter. This is where the important information is at in any letter. Or I should say, what Paul really wants to communicate as far as instruction about the Christian lifestyle. So in the body of the letter, it is important that you take note of a couple things. Now, I am going to be very upfront with you. What I'm getting ready to show you cannot be... It would be very difficult, that's what I'll say. I'm not going to say it cannot be found. It would be extremely difficult to find this without working in the original language. And so there is a word that Paul uses in chapter 1, verse 27, and a form of that word shows up in chapter 3, verse 20. It's the Greek word associated that we get politics from. Now, what's so interesting about this is it didn't mean politics back then. It just meant behavior. But it was behavior associated with a group's values or expectations. So Romans were enamored with the rule of law. So they expected people to abide by the rule of law. And so they had this word for it. And it's a polit word is what it is, where we get politics from, where we get policy from, where we get polity from. It's the same word. But here's what's so unique. This word in the Greek that's used in Philippians is hardly used at all in the New Testament. It seems unique in a way to Philippians, or more prominent within Philippians. There are a lot of words for behavior, but there's not very many words for behavior associated with some kind of expectations of a group. So it doesn't matter. Whatever group you're in, there's expectations associated with that group. So if you're in this group, there would be some certain expectations. Could be another group and be different expectations. But the word still applies to both groups in that a person within this group or a person within that group was expected to obey according to the behaviors that were engendered to this group, or behaviors that were a part of this group. And same with this other one. It wouldn't necessarily mean they're acting the same, but they were acting according to the expectations of that group. So in chapter 1, verse 27, now I'm not sure, I think it says conduct yourselves. In fact, I didn't look at a lot of different translations here. It's going to be something about conduct in your English translation, or behavior, or something like that. But the word is associated with behaviors associated with a political body. That's the idea. Behaviors associated with a political body. Now, that politics was nothing like what it is today, so don't carry today's political situation into the text. Just understand what's going on back at that time. So in chapter 1, verse 27, we have this word for behavior associated with citizenry within the Roman Empire. In chapter 3, verse 20, we have the word show up again, except this time it's not a verb as it was in chapter 1, verse 27, but now it is a noun, and it is the word citizenship. Citizenship. So one is a noun cognate, the other is the verb, but they come from the same root about behavior associated with a certain group. So, in between chapter 1, verse 27, and chapter 3, verse 20, we have examples of people. Remember, I'm talking about behavior associated with a group. So the first example we have is the example of Jesus. In fact, he tells the people, I want you to have the same mindset that Jesus had. Basically is what he said. Our first example is Jesus. We need to learn about his behavior associated with the kingdom of God and behave as he does. Our second example is Timothy and the way he behaved as a Christian within God's kingdom. In fact, it says in there, he says, you guys know about Timothy's ministry, how sincere he is in his ministry achievements and ministry attempts, his ministry endeavors. Then we have Epaphroditus. And Paul says, this guy was willing to die for the expansion of the gospel kingdom. Behaviors associated with God's kingdom. Jesus, Timothy, Epaphroditus, good examples. Then we have the example of Paul, who turned his life around. In fact, Paul's so interesting because he was actually on the road to become a religious star. He was going to be the Pharisee of Pharisees. I mean, he was well above his colleagues. He says so in chapter 3. But he says he considered all that to be worthless after he met Jesus Christ and found out what the new covenant meant and about this new salvation in Jesus Christ. He let it all go and he said it was all trash. It was all trash when I found out the truth in Jesus Christ. And then we have a bad example, these Judaizers. Let me explain to you Judaizers and why they are not Christian. They are not Christian. Judaizers are Jewish people. In fact, the term Judaizer does not show up in Philippians, but it has to be the same behavior that we've experienced or seen experienced in Galatians, where Judaizers, the term is used. Judaizers are Jewish people who are still hanging on to the old covenant, but they're accepting Jesus as being something special. They acknowledge, yeah, Jesus is special, but they're still holding on to the old covenant, and they're trying to mix old covenant values into the new covenant. Many people have had terms for it. I think the best is legalism, where the idea is they're adding legal requirements to the new covenant that were never there by adding those old covenant things, such as you have to be circumcised, you have to follow certain dietary restrictions, you have to observe the Sabbath, you have to observe all the Jewish festivals. In other words, you have to be Jewish to be a Christian. And Paul's saying, no, that's not true. Judaizers are telling you this. They're adding stuff, but it is not in the new covenant. And the new covenant is all about Christ. And so they are a bad example because they have not let go of the old covenant and they've not embraced Christ fully as the only means of redemption. They are bringing in other things. They are muddying the purity of Christianity. And so we have these examples, 4 good examples and 1 bad example. And we are to understand that we are to live like the 4 good examples and not like the Judaizers, who are a bad example. In fact, Euodia and Syntyche is another bad example, but they fall outside, but they're acting more like the Judaizers than Jesus, Timothy, Epaphroditus, or Paul. So this is important when we start to understand this, that this is about behavior associated with a group. Now, as Christians, we are citizens of heaven, as I said, chapter 3, verse 20. Our citizenship is in heaven, is what Paul says. And because of that, we are to act according to the expectations of that kingdom. And so we act like Christians. So we have to have behavior that is linked to God and behave like Jesus, Paul, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. And not act like the Judaizers, adding things to the text in order to exclude people from becoming Christian, basically. And we can't become like Euodia and Syntyche, quarrelsome and contentious. It's just not the way people are supposed to behave in God's kingdom work. So Philippians is about appropriate behavior within God's kingdom. That's all I've got for today. Next week we'll start in on chapter 1. I'll go basically from, I won't get all the way through chapter 1. We'll just go through the opening section and the Thanksgiving section. That'll be about it. In fact, I probably will only get through verse 11 of chapter 1 for next week. So next week, if you want to go ahead and start reading through Philippians, I urge you to. And I would urge you to read through the entire letter in one setting. It would be much, much better if you did it that way. So I will come back again next Thursday, and we will pick up on Philippians, and we'll go through Philippians 1 through 11 next week. So have a great week. And take care. Bye.